Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Pierre, for a wonderful introduction. I think some of my talk will repeat some of the things that Pierre said, but it's kind of my take, and I think it's good stuff to, hear more about. My name is Yulia. I am assistant professor at the University of Guelph. I primarily work on transportation, which is quite removed from cognitive architectures, but it's been my passion for the past 10 years, and I'm always happy to talk about it. It's something that I really enjoyed working on, and I try to incorporate it as much as I can into my other work. So today's talk is going to be on decision-making in cognitive architectures from rule-based to data-driven. And most of this material is actually from our latest book on the computational evolution of cognitive architectures. It was published fall last year. And basically, I will start with definitions. So I will talk again about what are cognitive architectures, because that will help me describe the rest of my talk. And obviously, the main question today is, what is decision-making? Again, lots of definitions. By decision-making, I will kind of split it into two broader areas, like reasoning about beliefs and reasoning about actions. And then I will talk a little bit about how we represent these things. So rule-based systems and LLMs, which are now de facto standard, at least in the AI world, for decision-making. And lastly, I will talk about evaluations, because I think that's a very important part of it that doesn't receive as much attention as it should. So, okay, let's start with the first definition. So Pierre already said it, but I want to repeat it again. So the most common definition is that it's a blueprint for intelligence. And by blueprint, we mean that it's some sort of a proposal or description of the computational procedures and representations that will result in some sort of intelligent behavior, right? That's the goal. And the concept belongs to Alan Newell. So the paper, the 1973 paper, You Can't Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win, it actually didn't introduce that concept, but it gave kind of a good start to it. And the whole idea of this paper was that, we want to compare science to playing 20 questions with nature. And you know the game of 20 questions, right? You have one person who is thinking of a concept, let's say an elephant, and you have another person who is trying to guess it. And they will ask that person multiple questions. So they will say, is it a small thing? The answer is no. Is it an animal? The answer is yes. And they'll just keep asking those questions. And eventually, hopefully before the 20 questions run out, they will have an answer. It's an elephant, right? They win. And we can think of science this way too, right? So instead of a person who's thinking of an elephant, now we have a mind and brain, which we don't know, and we want to find out more about. And we as scientists, we're playing with nature this game of 20 or probably 20,000 questions, right? And, we'll run experiments. We produce hypotheses, which are usually yes and no kind of questions. So we'll run experiments, and, let's say we run one experiment says yes, then another one says no. And, we'll keep going and going and going. And the idea is that eventually we'll have this grand theory of how everything works. I mean, that's how it worked in physics, right? So we should kind of get there. So in 1973, and that's the reason why Newell wrote that paper, there wasn't a grand theory yet. There were a lot of small theories of, individual pieces of cognition, but it wasn't clear how they will fit together and if they fit at all. And, almost 50 years later, we're still in the same situation, right? So the question is, why didn't this theory emerge? And there are many answers. I think some of them Newell gave. Some of them came later. And for me, it's probably these three, so I will talk about them more. So the first problem, which is kind of making it different from physics, is that cognitive phenomena are really difficult to define and very difficult to quantify. So we can find ways to assign certain numbers to certain concepts. For example, we have like IQ is a number, right? So we can say somebody has an IQ of 100. But it doesn't behave like a number. So we can't just put two people with IQ of 100 together and they will work like a person with IQ of 200. It just doesn't work this way, right? It's not, you can't apply arithmetic to it easily. So we can't really easily combine things together. The other problem is that experiments, the questions that we ask, they don't have a lot of precision. So first, the space of possibilities and factors is enormous. Anybody who has ever tried to design a human experiment, you realize like how much you have to, you just can't run, you can't have 10,000 subjects, you can't have 10,000 conditions, you have to narrow it down. And it's really hard to figure out which one will matter in the end. And because of that, we also have issues with replicability. So it's really hard to repeat the same study because you have different subjects, they will behave differently. It's really hard to do all of these comparisons. And the last problem is that even if you run that experiment, let's say it's completely replicable, everything is fine, but it potentially can fit many, many, many theories. So we have a problem with falsifiability. So we can't really disprove a theory with a single experiment. We need to run many of them. And again, we'll hit all of those other issues, right? So Newell proposed this project of cognitive architectures as a way of dealing with this problem. So this is the famous book, Unified Theories of Cognition, which came out in 1990. And there he actually fleshed out the concept of cognitive architectures fully. And he fleshed it out as a solution that will, first, it will unify the theories with experimental data. So we will use theory to guide the experiments, right? To give us some sort of way of narrowing it down. So that solves the problem with this exponential explosion and what we're going to study. It also integrates multiple experiments into one big system. So once you start building a cognitive architecture, you'll kind of see, oh, this part is missing. I have to implement it, but it's missing. Or these two parts, like I'm trying to put together these two experiments and they don't fit together. So that kind of helps solve the second problem. And the third condition was that it must be implemented computationally. So we don't want a solution that will take an infinite time to run, because this is not how human brain works. We do stuff, in reasonable time usually. So that kind of limits us to complete and viable solutions, something that we can actually implement and look at. So bringing back Mar, I think it's also useful to think about cognitive architectures in terms of different levels of abstraction. So it's the same kind of framework as what Newell was saying, but in kind of different angle of it. So David Marr published this book in 1982. It's called Vision. And although the framework wasn't intended for cognitive architectures, actually fits it quite well. So the first level, the top level, is the computational theory. So we're asking a general question: what are we trying to do and why we're trying to do it? So it's a very philosophical kind of high level. There's not much detail here. It's just a general kind of framework of what we're going to do. Then at the level below, we have representations and algorithms. So this is how we're going to do it, how we intend to actually try and implement it. And then at the bottom level, we have hardware. So eventually it has to run on some sort of hardware. It could be kind of a brain, a neuron, or it could be some sort of electronics. But either way, it's going to run on something. And we have some understanding of that hardware to put some constraints on what we can and cannot implement. So the tricky part about this is that the relationships between these levels are not one-to-one. So, you can have a single computational theory that can be represented by a ton of different algorithms. Every single algorithm can potentially belong to multiple theories. And same goes at the two levels below. So let's say we have a certain representation that can only run on a single type of hardware. Well, that rarely happens. Usually you would have many-to-many relationship here too. And when you kind of blend it together with cognitive architectures, you see why it would work. So we have basically constraints from the top and from the bottom. So our computational theory will constrain what we're going to investigate. And from the bottom, we have a constraint on what we can actually run on the hardware that we have. And that will kind of help us to figure out what are the representations and the algorithms that we can use to implement these systems. And, when we are modeling them, it's a necessarily iterative process because of this structure. So we will first define a theory and maybe take somebody else's theory, right? We will define some tasks and metrics, something that we can actually use to tell if is it working, is it not working? And then we will implement it, and then we'll test the implementation using our criteria. And we'll see, okay, is it working, or is there something we're missing, or whatever. And then we'll just keep doing this loop And in case of some of the architectures, they've been doing this loop for like 40 years now. And eventually we'll probably come up with a decent architecture. That was the idea. So just to sum it up before I move on to other things, is the whole idea of the enterprise of the cognitive architectures is that we want to unify multiple levels of abstraction such that we can actually deal with all of this explosion of possible things to look at. So we want to unify the theories with implementations. We want to pull together different levels of abstraction. We want to have a sort of a theory for high-level top-down guidance. And from the bottom up, we have a hardware constraints. So it tells us what we can and cannot do. And in the middle, we're going to deal with all of the gaps and inconsistencies, right? So the idea is that we will iteratively go through this and improve our theory and improve our algorithms at the same time. So the unique thing about cognitive architectures is that they're kind of at the intersection of multiple fields. Specifically, it's cognitive science and AI, because we're trying to apply theories from cognitive science while implementing them with stuff that we borrow from AI. But the aim is quite different from what AI is trying to do in general, the field of AI. We're trying to actually understand how human mind and brain works. So have some sort of a mechanistic explanation, not just some artifact that performs some things, right? Okay, so that's that for the cognitive architectures. Now we're going to go slightly lower level. So it's not quite representations. That's what we're trying to do. So a typical architecture will have many components, and decision-making is just one small component of them. I just want to put it here so that you're aware that there is more to decision-making than it seems. So most architectures will have a sort of this kind of never-ending loop. So they will start by perceiving the environment, so some sort of input of any kind. They will extract something that's relevant to whatever it is that they're about to do, to their goals. They will store some information to achieve those goals and maybe later use it if it's good. They will derive new information. So that's the process we will call learning in general. And then they will use all of the stuff to decide what to do next. And lastly, they will actually do it if there is some motor action needed. So today we're only going to talk about decision-making, but it's kind of related and it's not really easy to separate from all of the other things. So when we think about decision-making, there are many other terms that are associated with it. And I want to, again, go back to definitions. So you've heard terms cognition, thinking, and reasoning. And to me, it was quite confusing what any of those mean, like how to actually explain them and how do they relate to decision-making. So here's my take on it. So if you look at the definitions of cognition, there is 3 groups of them. So the first group is quite narrow. So it's people who say that only anything that's language-like, so something that we can express in words, goes under the umbrella of cognition. So if we can think about it and we can express it, that's cognition. There is a group of people who think that any sort of mental activity below low-level vision, so once you start thinking maybe about seeing or start reasoning about, where things are relevant to one another, that's cognition. So it kind of covers most of what cognitive architectures can do. And there is even a broader group that basically says that any sort of processing that you do in the brain of any kind, doesn't matter what it is, it's verbal, non-verbal, subconscious, conscious, all of it is cognition. So it's in my opinion, it's not particularly useful definition because it kind of is everything. So, but it exists there. And the same thing applies to thinking. So there are people who say that thinking is only high-level cognition. So it would be some particularly logical inference. So everything that is not logical inference would not be considered thinking. There are a group of people who say thinking is only deliberate stuff, so something that we can control. So if I touch a hot stove and I pull my hand away, I'm not really thinking. That's a reflexive thing. There is no thinking involved. But as long as I think about it and I do it voluntarily, that's what we would call thinking. And there is another camp that basically equates thinking to cognition. So basically any sort of, again, information processing, any mental activity would be considered thinking. And then the last concept is reasoning. And again, it's the same thing. So there are people who think it's high level logical inference, people who think that it's non-reflexive, and people who think that it's basically the same thing as a cognition and thinking. So you kind of see my point here I'm trying to drive is that definitions are quite tricky. And that's kind of what has been problematic in cognitive science for a while, because it's really hard to pull all of these concepts together. So if we talk specifically about the cognitive architectures that are implemented, that exist, majority of them actually are in this kind of narrow camp. So they treat cognition and thinking and reasoning as sort of high level, mostly logical inference, or something verbal. But some of them don't. There is a few that don't. So if we pull it all together, we kind of get this picture. So cognition is the most general term. It's most frequently used in the most general sense. Thinking is kind of a subset of that. Reasoning is a subset of thinking, and decision-making is a subset of reasoning. That's at least how it's usually treated in the literature. Other things we can see is reasoning is sometimes presented as theoretical reasoning and decision-making as practical reasoning. So what it means that when we're reasoning, we're actually thinking about beliefs, we're reasoning about beliefs. And when we're making decisions, we're reasoning about actions. So even simpler, when we're reasoning, we're trying to think of what to think next. And when we're making decisions, we're trying to figure out what are we going to do next. So to expand a bit on that, when we're trying to reason about beliefs, the whole idea is that we want to form a relatively coherent picture of the world. And that's based on our experiences, observations, interactions, memory. So it's all coming from all of those other activities that we do. And when we are reasoning about actions, what we want to do is we want to select the best available to us action that we can perform that will bring us closer to our goal. And the best action criteria could be numerous, and we'll talk about it later in the talk. So the most important ones are relevant, how useful the action is, so utility of the action, and urgency, how quickly do we need to make that decision. So this distinction is, in my opinion, is primarily conceptual, just to help us understand the concept. But in reality, these two are really, really hard to separate. So first, they use the same mechanisms, more or less. And they're also quite interconnected. So when you're thinking about what to do, you actually need to have before that some sort of a coherent picture of what's happening. And if you perform an action, you would necessarily change your picture of the world. So it's really hard to, in practice, to separate these. And most cognitive architectures actually don't. But since we can separate them conceptually, I will keep to it. And I will continue talking about reasoning about beliefs. So there are two categories of reasoning that are quite useful to know. One is monotonic reasoning, and the second one is non-monotonic reasoning. So just give you two examples. So monotonic reasoning is when you have a sort of a claim that doesn't change when you add more claims to it. So let's say we figured out that Earth orbits the sun. So currently that is the prevailing hypothesis, I guess. So that's the truth. And if we come up with another statement, let's say moon orbits the Earth, or Earth is not spherical, it doesn't actually change the original premise. I mean, it still is reconcilable with the original statement. So they do not change anything for us. They just kind of expand it, make it more clear. With the non-monotonic reasoning is different. So let's say I have a statement that all Indian prime ministers are male. And then I observe that Indira Gandhi became an Indian prime minister. So based on this evidence, I'm not going to assume that Indira Gandhi became a male. I'm actually going to change my original statement. So I will say instead that not all Indian PMs are male. So I'm going back, and that's why it's non-monotonic. So monotonic goes in one direction, non-monotonic can change direction, depending on the new evidence that we get. And this kind of relates to the mechanisms that we use to implement it. So a lot of reasoning is treated as a type of logical reasoning. And there are different types of logical reasoning. So there's deduction, induction, abduction, and analogy. And deduction is the only one that's monotonic. So again, we've seen this example. I'll show you a different one. So let's say you have a statement, when it rains, the roofs are wet. If it rains now, the roofs are wet. I mean, there is nothing you can change about the statement. These other two statements are basically an expansion of the first one. So it's a monotonic reasoning example. The other three are non-monotonic. And again, the examples will show why. So induction is basically we're going from original premise to some other premises that are supported by it, but not necessarily. So let's say I observe that when it rains, the roofs are wet. So if somebody tells me it's going to rain tomorrow, I'm going to assume reasonably that the roofs will be wet tomorrow, but I'll have to live until tomorrow to see if it's actually true. Abduction is kind of the opposite of deduction. So you start with the observation and you try to figure out what are the premises for that observation. So let's say you're looking at the roofs and they're all wet. So you're kind of assuming it must have rained recently, but it could have been anything else. I mean, somebody could just dump water on them, right? So you don't know, but you're just making the most likely assumption. And analogy is not always separated as a separate kind of reasoning, and I'll explain why later, but it's just trying to establish similarities between statements. So we can say a roof is to the house as an umbrella to a person, and it kind of makes sense, right? So the reason why analogy is not always separated into a separate kind of type of reasoning is because it combines induction and abduction. So to form an analogy, you need to apply both. So you will start with induction to identify similarities. So you will observe multiple roofs, rains, and people with umbrellas, and you kind of make that leap that, oh, umbrellas and, people are kind of similar to roofs and, when there is how they protect houses, right? And then you need to apply abduction to test whether it actually holds. So you can then kind of apply the statement, if umbrella is wet, it likely rained recently, and it does make sense, right? So the analogy in this particular case holds. So why am I telling you all this? Is that because not many cognitive architectures actually bother with these things. There are not that many that specifically look at different types of logical reasoning. And none of them, as far as I know, look at specifically at monotonic reasoning because it's not really interesting. There are several that I'm sure are defunct now. Oscar, Disciple, and Disciple I think still exists, but Oscar and Shruti I'm pretty sure are not actively developed. They're looking at induction and abduction. And there are several other projects, Copycat, Companion, Lisa, and Dual are the biggest ones that look specifically at analogy. And in fact, these are very interesting projects because they say that analogy is the basis of any sort of reasoning. Unfortunately, out of these four, only Companion is still being actively developed, but it's a good architecture to look if you're interested in analogy. And it's probably a good field to look into because it's not really popular. And I think there is a lot to discover there. So I can talk more about the beliefs. I want to switch to actions now. So when we're making an action, when we're making decision about an action, we typically go through this decision-making loop. So sometimes it's called like perceive act loop. There's many terms for it, but the idea is the same. So we are in a certain situation currently. We try to estimate what can we actually do in this situation. Then from this set of actions, we pick one and we perform it. And then we go back to the original, the first step. So something will change or maybe not change. And then we'll just keep looking for possible actions to do and just selecting one every time. So unlike the other one, the reasoning about beliefs, this is actually implemented in all cognitive architectures. And it also often uses logical reasoning, although it's not really thought of this way, but they do use a lot of induction, abduction, and analogy to complete these steps. So there are two questions that I want to discuss for this section. First is how do we perform the selection? And second is what do we consider the best action? So, so how do we perform the selection? So there are two kind of main ideas about it. So the first one is that we do it deliberately. So we actually sit down and we try to, think carefully about what is the current state of the agent, what are the goals that they're trying to achieve, and then we list all of the actions that are available, plan them into like a sequence, and then execute that sequence. So let's say if we have a robot that's trying to traverse this maze, they will, look at the whole maze, try to plan as far as they can go, and then will execute these actions. Another approach is the opposite of this. We're just doing whatever we can, just choose something. So there's no state nor deliberation. We just map sensory inputs directly into motor commands. So this is kind of end-to-end stuff that LLMs do more or less. So basically, we just pick one available action based on whatever criteria, execute that, then pick another one, execute that. Let's say we hit the wall, so we know that we can't go any further, so we'll just turn somewhere and just keep wandering around this maze. Eventually, maybe we'll come out, maybe we'll get stuck. We don't know. So I'm sure you can see that there are problems with either of these. So the biggest problem with planning and deliberation is that it's really, really, really difficult to get a full description of the domain. We usually don't have it. And even if we have it, planning all of the possibilities, even within a small domain, is usually computationally intractable. So you have to do some heuristics, you have to do something else. Even a bigger problem is that while you're doing all of this planning, especially if it takes time, things can change. And once you start executing it, you will notice that your plan doesn't apply anymore. So you have to stop and start replanning, which will take more time and things may change again. And that's why the early approaches don't actually, they've been trying to use those plans, but nobody is doing that anymore, really. There were attempts to do everything with reactive actions only, and the most prominent example is subsumption architecture by Brooks. But as you can imagine, it only works for very, very simple tasks. So something like navigation, probably, but if you want to have anything more complex, you actually do need state, and you do need to reason about things. So the solution currently that everybody is more or less following is that we combine both aspects of it. So we are going to use deliberation for doing high-level goals. So decide on a high level, let's say I want to go to the kitchen, right? And then we are going to divide that goal into subtasks. So, to go to the kitchen, I need to make a step, walk 5 meters there, turn and do that kind of stuff. And then we use reactive actions to basically turn it into motor actions. So because they're quite more predictable and it's a very, very constrained problem. Another useful application for reactive actions is reflexes and learned shortcuts. So for example, you learned that, I don't know, you learned how to move quickly from one point to another. And next time you have to go from point A to B, you will just use that learned shortcut. You don't have to plan it again. Right. So now about the selection. So how do we select the best action? What do we actually mean by the best action? So there's a lot of theory about it. There's a lot of cognitive science papers that studied how people make decisions, how animals make decisions. And they have a long list of criteria of what is considered best. So the first obvious criteria is that the action has to be appropriate. So if you want to go to the kitchen, obviously you're not going to go outside because it's not appropriate. The action has to be sufficient. It doesn't have to be optimal. It just has to bring the agent a bit closer to their goal. As long as it performs that action, it's good enough. Action has to be performed one at a time. So one effector can only perform one action, and that's just a physical limitation. So let's say I have my hand, I cannot move it left and right at the same time. I have to do it sequentially, and I have to choose which one I'm going to do first. Another condition is that the action must be timely. So it has to be somehow related to the speed of changes in the environment and to the speed of, what the agent can perform. It also has to be persistent. So we don't want to oscillate between two different actions. Let's say an agent needs to do two things. you want to do one thing for a little bit, then switch to the other thing instead of oscillating, because that's not useful. It also has to be non-interfering. We don't want the action that we choose to cancel the effects of all of the other actions, unless it's needed. So unintentionally, we don't want to do it. And it has to be interruptible. So often we find ourselves doing some things and then we have to interrupt them, do something else, and then come back to the previous action that we finished. So it's an important thing. That allows us to multitask, essentially. So this is what we have in theory. Now, what about practice? So if we look in practice, what's happening? Relevance, of course, is there. And typically, we would define relevance as something like actions that are relevant to the goal. So that's there. Sometimes in many implementations, you would see that they use random actions. So that's just to explore the space of possibilities a little bit more. But in general, later, it would be kind of some utility score would be assigned to it. And then if the agent needs to choose it again, if the action wasn't usable, it wouldn't be chosen. Utility is basically what I just said. If the action has been useful in the past, we'll do it again in a similar situation. Urgency is kind of a temporal limit on action. So, sometimes you need to do things urgently because, like let's say somebody throws a ball at the robot, they have to catch it as it arrives, not after, 3 minutes after and not 3 minutes before. And there's another criteria that you see in the literature, which is called priority, which is a combination of some of all of the criteria above. So as you can see, there is a bit of a discrepancy between what we do in practice and what we know is important in theory. Specifically, if we look at the implementations, majority of them focus only on the two first criteria. So we're only looking at how appropriate is the action and whether it's good enough, for the goal. Everything else is more or less ignored. There were several architectures in the 90s that looked into timing of the actions, but they didn't make a lot of progress there. And I know that some architectures also looked at the interruptible actions, but again, it's not a common thing to look into. So just the takeaway from this is that we know a lot of theory, but most of it is not considered in practice whatsoever. Another topic I want to raise, and I think somebody will give more detailed talk on this later, is behavior modulation. So living organisms, they usually have certain characteristics that make them more likely to perform certain actions. And we divide them into three big groups. So one is drives. So these are kind of innate things. So we don't want to harm ourselves. We have a basic survival. So, get food or get energy or something like that. So these are drives. There are also emotions. So these are kind of transient states that arise temporarily from our assessment of the current situation. So let's say I am very happy to be here now, but once this talk finishes, I probably will have a different emotion associated with something else. And traits are basically a very kind of innate characteristics of the organism or living organism, which we would call maybe something like personality. So that kind of affects how our drives and emotions are distributed. So, a person could be generally negative, so they wouldn't feel happy as often as a person who is more of an optimist. So I'll leave it at this. This is a relatively unexplored area. Not many architectures explicitly included, so I don't have much to say beyond this. And one last thing I want to mention is reasoning about reasoning. So this is when we try to monitor what we're doing and use that information to either control better, choose better actions, or to learn how to do something better. So again, this is not an area that received a lot of attention, so I'm not going to go too much into it. So again, to sum it up before I move on to representations, is that we have two types of reasoning. So one type of reasoning is thinking about what to think, and the other type of reasoning is to think about what to do. And they're not really separable. Yeah, thank you. They're not really separable. And they would, so to reason about actions, you actually need to reason about beliefs first. And once you reason about beliefs, you will probably come up with some sort of action. There's typically not a lot of work on behavior modulation and meta reasoning, so I'll leave it at that. So now the interesting part is, how do we combine all of this together when we come to representations? And as my title of my talk says, there are two major types of representations. One is rules, the other one is kind of data-driven, or I just call them LLMs because that's the standard these days. So when you're building a rule-based system, what you're going to do first, you're going to analyze the task and domain that you're working in. You will encode it into statements, define rules of inference, and then once you build the whole system, you'll try to tune it. So let's say my task and domain is making a coffee. So I will split it into different subtasks. So I will have to go to the kitchen, boil water, find the cup, find coffee, put the coffee into the cup, all of that stuff. Then I will encode it into statements. So I will express it in some sort of a logical representation, like a predicate logic, frame, semantic network, anything. But it has to be explicit. And then I will define rules of inference. So how do I work with this stuff? So how do I replace variables in expressions? How do I combine expressions? All of that goes into rules of inference. And when I run the system, I can, maybe I'll notice that I missed one step in my original subtasking. So I'll add that rule. Or I will adjust the global parameters, or maybe I'll add extra criteria. So that's the basic, it sounds simple, but it's not, but it's the basic idea of how rule-based systems operate. When we build an LLM, the process is very, very, very different. So we'll start by gathering a lot of data first. Then we'll encode it into tokens. Then we'll define the network structure, and then we'll train it. And all of these processes are kind of have sub-processes within them. So first, majority of LLMs are trained on enormous amount of data that is non-domain specific. It's just loads and loads and loads of text from various sources. A lot of it comes from Reddit, which is, I think, scary to me, but that's where it comes from. And a lot of it comes from books, not very ethically sourced. And the other source of information is instruction output pairs. So these are also huge data sets, but they're kind of domain specific. So let's say they would have an example, right? A haiku about the crane, and there will be an example of haikus. So these are kind of labeled examples. And the last step is to gather human preferences. So LLMs are probabilistic. Anytime you run it on anything, it will produce multiple inputs or outputs. So we want to know which outputs people like more. So it's literally people sitting and choosing ranking the answers for every query. So they have data sets of that as well. The next step is we encode it into tokens. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's basically we're converting it from language to some sort of a numeric representation. Then we define a network structure. These days it's a transformer, and we define a loss function, which is these days is a cross entropy. And then we train. So the unsupervised training is the first step. We take that pile of data from the very, very top of the slide, and we'll learn to predict the next token. So we give it a sentence and then try to predict the next word that follows. Then we do a bit of supervised fine-tuning. This is where we use our instruction output pairs. So we'll ask it to write a poem and train it until it writes a reasonably similar poem to what we gave it as a predicted output. And then we do alignment using RL with human in the loop. And we are basically teaching the model to align better with preferences of people. So it would give us high-ranked answers, answers that are closer to what people ranked higher. It will give it more probability. Again, it's a very simplified picture of it, but the reason why I'm showing it is because of this. So once we go through this process, we will get two very different systems. So rule-based systems in general, they result in this big knowledge base on which we perform inference and from which we derive outputs. So you can see that both of them are graph-like, but the graphs themselves are quite different. So when we are talking about rule-based systems, the graph is heterogeneous and it's localist. So every node in this graph can be assigned a specific meaning. So we can have a node that says a cat, we have a node that says an animal, we can define an edge between it as a kind of relationship. And we can assign any number of other parameters to it and attributes. When we talk about neural networks or LLMs, individual nodes have no meaning, and every node can be part of a different concept. So we can have, let's say, 3 nodes, the blue ones that represent together a cat, and we have 3 other nodes that are pink that represent an animal. And you can see that there is an overlap between them, but there could be none either. So that's the first main difference. The second main difference is that the topology of these networks is not the same. So for rule-based systems, the topology is not fixed. So every time I add a new concept, it can actually change my whole network. It can rearrange it completely. For the LLMs, the topology remains fixed at all times. The only things that changes is the weight. And rules, again, the rules for rule-based systems, they're heterogeneous and explicit. So usually they're in the form if X, then Y, and we can replace X and Y with whatever we want. For LLMs, the rules are homogeneous, implicit, and usually governed by the loss function. So everything is the same. So the relationship between 2 nodes are always going to be the same. So that results in a lot of interesting properties. So I just put it here in the table so that it's easy to compare them side by side. So rule-based systems are generally more transparent because we can estimate the meaning of each node. For LLMs, it's going to be an induction. So we're going to establish some correlations between the concepts, but that's about as far as we can go. There is a better explainability. We can interpret the decisions of the rule-based systems because, again, we know what everything means. But in LLMs, the best we can do is just, again, correlations between inputs and outputs, and we can kind of maybe establish what they're thinking. Learning is automatic in rule-based systems, and it can continue as long as the system is alive. For LLMs, although there are some online learning for LLMs, but majority of them are trained, frozen, and then they just kind of perform one-shot inference on the new inputs. One interesting property, which I unfortunately don't have time to talk about, is consistency. So because we can assign truth values to our nodes, and we have rules of inference, we can actually maintain and enforce truthfulness and consistency in the rule-based systems. And we don't have as much control over it in LLMs. The best bet we can do is that our data is completely consistent and very, very accurate and very true. And then we hope that our LLM learns something good from it, but that obviously doesn't happen. So 2 other things that I mentioned before briefly is behavior modulation and meta reasoning. So again, it's quite easy to do in rule-based systems because we can just add parameters to the system explicitly and guide it how to react to certain things and assign emotions to it. Meta reasoning is also easy because we can apply inference to whatever to the description of the system itself. I mean, it's all the same rules anyway. For LLMs, it's much harder to do. So emotions, as far as I know, nobody is really doing it seriously. And for meta reasoning, the best we can do is ask an LLM, what were you thinking? But it will just generate some random text, which usually doesn't have much to do with what it was actually thinking. Okay, so I think am I nearly out of time? I have 1 minute. I probably need maybe like 3-4 minutes to finish this. Is it okay? I'm sorry. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk, and I think this is what I've been leading to, is evaluating decision-making. So it's super important because this is how we actually learn what are the gaps in theories and how we can improve them for our loop that I was showing you before. So any complex system is usually very, very difficult to evaluate. So we have these 3 different levels of abstraction. So how do we evaluate it? Do we evaluate each one individually? Do we look at the individual components? How do we actually figure out which part of it is similar to humans? And it's a very difficult problem. And again, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But what we came up with as a community is that we'll use a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. So besides that, we also do kind of a narrow and broad evaluations. So the narrow evaluation would be task-based evaluation. So we define a specific task, let's say move an object from this point to that point, or navigate to the kitchen. we will create a bunch of scenarios for that task. So we will do different layouts of the environment. We'll do different positioning of the agent initially. We'll add clutter, change instructions, all of that. And then we'll combine it into like a test set, run the agent on all of these tasks and measure their performance. And that will tell us something about its performance, right? But that only tests on a very narrow level. So it only tests mainly the implementation level. So how do we test more broader things like, does it actually show intelligent behavior? So for this, we have so-called ability-based evaluation, and majority of them are either variants of Turing test. So we're trying to decide, we ask people to judge whether the machine is in any way similar to humans, whatever they think about it. So it's very subjective. Or we do some sort of a variation of psychometric tests. So basically, we have some idea of how to measure intelligence of humans, so we'll just apply the same to the machines. And in terms of like how to actually do it, there are again many different ways of doing it. So we can do it non-comparatively or comparatively. So we can just evaluate one thing just against itself or just on its own. We can compare it to others. We can do it quantitatively or qualitatively. And we can look at effectiveness and performance. So by effectiveness, we mean, did it finish the task in however way? And by performance, we actually look at how well the task was done. How long did it take? How much computation did it take? So I was very interested in how it's been done historically in cognitive architecture. So I went through a bunch of papers from, was it 1970 to 2018? So that was 67 architectures, probably about 2,000 papers. And I just went through all of the experiments that they did, and I categorized them into different groups. So this is a picture from the book. So the first graph basically shows, I just looked at which ones are quantitative and which ones are qualitative. And you can see that 60% of all of the evaluations are quantitative. If we look at the LLMs, they kind of use a mix as well. So that's kind of similar. If we look at the qualitative evaluation methods, like the vast majority of them are demos. So it's just either a text description, we ran this system and it did this, or just a video, or maybe some photo of it. And about 4% is something else, like it was difficult to categorize. This is the most interesting plot, in my opinion. I think it's the most telling. So here, I'm splitting the quantitative evaluation methods into comparative and non-comparative, and whether they use humans or not. So this 25% here, so this is a non-comparative qualitative evaluation without any comparison. So we just run one architecture on a single task, measure the results, and report it. So LLMs, sorry, this shouldn't be here now. There are about 34% of architectures that only compare to human data. So it's a single architecture, they replicate an experiment, and they show the results of it. Comparisons are done in 23% of the cases, and they're usually limited to a few other cognitive architectures. So we run the competitor on the same task, and show the results. AI models are rarely, very rarely included in this comparison. Sometimes we, in 10% of the cases, they compare against others plus humans. So kind of to show how they measure up against others with respect to humans. And this is the smallest group. This is the benchmarks. So that's about 8%. Very, very few cognitive architectures are ever run on standardized benchmarks, and very rarely against AI models. If we look at the LLMs, if I had to plot this for LLMs, this would probably be about 100%. I would say 99% maybe. So there's a huge difference in how we conduct evaluations across these different types of models. So I'm going to be wrapping up now. I think I have three more slides. So the conclusion from this is that evaluation is a massive, massive problem. And I think that's part of why the field hasn't been progressing as fast as Newell would have hoped. And the problem is that first, there is not a lot of code. So about 30% of the cognitive architectures have some sort of code, but even if it exists, it's really, really hard to use. I mean, I did try and it was difficult. Majority of demos don't work out of the box. And if you try to do something with them, it's really difficult. Another problem, and it's kind of a feature rather than a bug of the cognitive architectures, is that they're very unique. So each one of them is written in a different language. which makes it also difficult to use because I'm good at C and C++ and maybe Python, but not good at Java and Lisp. So it's harder for me to do it, or for anybody else who has a different skill set. Another problem is that there are different formats for inputs and outputs. So it's really, really hard to, again, compare them head to head. And they also do different processing. And there is no common infrastructure for running and testing them. Also, every cognitive architecture kind of solves a unique problem. So even if you can run them, they're often not tested on even remotely the same data and tasks. So it's really hard to make even some estimate of how they would do. And changing the cognitive architecture to a different task is just a whole different can of worms. So it's really, really difficult to do. So to conclude, I just want to say that the problems, in my opinion, that were posed by Newell in the 70s, they remain largely unresolved. I think cognitive architectures have enormous potential, but it hasn't been realized. And I think partially because of the decision-making itself, that it wasn't really explored to its fullest, and partially because of the lack of proper evaluation. So the focus has been primarily on very narrow understanding of what decision-making is. And there are very few architectures that look at the full gamut of what goes into decision-making. And I also don't think that LLMs solve these problems automatically, not at all. And they're just replacing the rule-based with whatever neural network, but they're still not looking at any of these factors, and they don't do evaluation properly either. We can't even tell if they're better or not. I mean, it would be tempting to say that LLMs are better because, oh, look at what they do. But I think that we don't have sufficient evidence because we actually never evaluated any LLMs properly against cognitive architectures. And we can't ignore the fact that the amount of money and human capital that we invested into LLMs is nowhere close. I mean, it's like orders of magnitude more than we ever did for cognitive architectures over the whole history of them. So it's not a fair comparison either way. And we also don't know which one of them is human-like. And again, it's a problem of evaluation. So there is a very disjoint evidence from cognitive architectures. And for LLMs, it's I'm trying to do it now myself. It's really, really hard to do it properly. So that's it. And I just want to show one last quote, which I really like from John McCarthy. This is from the paper in 2007. What he said is, it will be much more scientifically satisfying to understand human-level artificial intelligence logically than just achieve it by a computerized evolutionary process that produced an intelligent but incomprehensible result. In fact, the logical approach would be worth pursuing, even if the intellectually lazier evolutionary approach won the race. I think I agree with this fully, and I hope you do too. I think it's worth doing it. Thank you very much.
The 10-minute vacation, and we're free to choose which one.
Excellent. Thank you.
10-minute vacations.
Yes, please.
Really expressive and it's refresh my memories with the previous courses. I agree with the Professor Kotseruba because you mentioned presentation and planning, etc. You straight a great theory that differentiate role-based system and language models. The last point you mentioned really the reasoning. What I understood from this terminology that you have used is that meta reasoning is the explainable AI, right?
In a sense, yes, but it's
because you mentioned like once we talk about role-based system, reasoning means that I can reason why I take this decision.
Yeah.
But with the LLM, I cannot give you the reliable decision because I go through a very hidden process.
Yep.
So it's meta reasoning for me. It's the target which talk about explainable AI systems.
Yes, but
in terms of ethical, also reliability,
yeah,
etc. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it has kind of two sides when you think about it. So one side is for the outside world, as you said, explainability. So, if I have a rule-based system, I can go through all of its decision trees and I can tell, how did it derive to that? Or it can produce the, how did it make those decisions, right? So I can actually look at it. For LLM, I cannot. But another thing is for the system itself. So you need meta reasoning to reason about your mistakes. as well, right? So let's say I want to reach that bottle and I kind of grab it here. The bottle is not here, so I'm learning from this. I'm grabbing something, but it's air or it's a different object. So this is where meta reasoning comes in. And again, we don't know if that exists in LLMs in any way. And we can't examine it because we don't have the.
Yeah, because it's here talk about actions.
Yeah, yeah. But we can't do it for actions or for reasoning, really. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, awesome talk. I loved it. It was amazing. Okay, so I was curious, like, when you're talking about when you were comparing LLMs or like deep learning models and rule-based systems, and you mentioned about how you can provide facts, new facts to rule-based systems. It seems like there's a thing that's not one-to-one about it, in the sense that when you add a new fact to a rule-based system, you're also providing the abstraction, like the representation. Whereas when you, like, obviously they're frozen, like you were saying, but like during training, you provide data that then the model has to compress. And that would be like the equivalent of a new fact would be whatever it sort of transforms the data into. So I'm wondering how you think about that asymmetry, because it seems to me like the fact that the model has to do more of the compression or abstraction is like a very good sign, like a positive aspect of deep learning models.
Well, yes and no, because again, you have very little control over it. And the other problem is that I think it's for me, at least when I think about these things. Sorry if it's kind of straying away from what you probably meant, but one of the things that I was thinking about, so if you read the literature, a lot of the reasons for abandoning rule-based systems is because we are not doing manual labor. As you said, we have to do the transformations ourselves, right? Instead of the model doing it for us. But if you think about LLMs, there is enormous amount of labor. I mean, all of those data sets that they showed, I mean, somebody had to go and write all of that. They hire people to solve, equations and write that down. So it's been happening. The only difference is that it's expert versus non-expert labor. So anybody can go and write a sentence, the sky is blue or the sky is green or whatever. Not everybody can go and study a specific process, let's say in radiology, split it into things and code it and then give it to, to a reasoning thing. So I think you're right that we are shifting what, where we do the manual work, we're shifting it from, so we don't have to do it manually, we kind of let the model learn. But with that, we also lose control. With that, we also lose the ability to interpret it later. And with that, we also lose the expertise in that task. Because now all you do is just collect data from the hospital. You don't know what's in it. You just dump it into a machine and hopefully it produces something useful.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I guess what I'm curious about is if you, like, there's definitely sort of in those two scenarios, there's comparable cognition happening, or I think sort of in each system when you consider the people as part of the loop. But if we're interested in trying to model sort of something that doesn't need to depend so much on our labor to get it to work, like I'm curious, like that's the aspect in which it seems promising to me that the deep learning models are forced to do some of that compression themselves versus being handled at abstraction. Of course, it has all the downsides you mentioned. Totally.
Yes, that's true. But again, the other problem is the original goal. We are not like when we're doing all of this compression with LLMs, we're not coming anywhere closer to figuring out what is happening inside. Yeah. So you kind of have to reason about it, and then you'd have to kind of encode it, or at least you have to reason about it enough to be able to test the LLM. So either way, you have to go through that step if you want to get anywhere closer to understanding how mind works. Right. Even if it's computationally impossible, whatever. I understand there are lots of people who think about it. But I still think it's worth trying.
Yeah, no, totally. At some point, it's kind of like if you have a baby, you can be like, look, this baby is a great AI, right?
Yeah. So I agree with you. In short, I agree with you, but I think there is a lot more discussion that needs to happen around these things. Yeah, please.
I'd like to bring back to the notions of metacognition, reasoning about reasoning. And in terms of building a cognition architecture, I think the main problem is that cognitive architecture or by artificial intelligence are deterministic and they have a purpose or goal that have been embedded into them. Such as, for example, we could say ChatGPT, his goal is to provide answers to anyone. And that means that based on this goal is the most important aspect of it because it's an entire purpose. And this is where ethics become problematic because as its goal is to answer all questions, it will try to gather information of very personal and lifeful distress in people to answer and to know more about these problems to answer more. That being said, metacognition is hard to define there because since even from rule-based system where there are rules to be made or deep learning where they are nodes in which there are weights in it, it will become a weight and a model to be made that has not perhaps the same weight as the purpose that has been originally made. Such as it will be hard to say about metaconnection or even maybe even monotonic as the conclusions that must be made is from the premise that cannot be invalidated. But what is to be invalidated or what is considered to be fruitful is entirely depending on what the AI is to gather from others. So that being said, how do you see reasoning about reasoning in a system that is not made for such a level? It's very difficult to see when all its weighted are weighted on certain.
Well, as you said, it's not made for it. I think that's the biggest problem. I mean, because the main goal of it is to produce the next token.
Right.
There is no other goal there. And to produce the next token, it doesn't, I mean, it probably would produce better tokens if it had some meta reasoning behind it. But it doesn't because it's a mostly feed-forward system. So there is no feedback loop of any kind. And it doesn't learn from that feedback loop. Right? So I think, at least in the current form, like if you take just a bare LLM, I don't think it's even like solvable within that paradigm. I don't think it's even part of it, and which I find problematic because we're trying to simulate something that is not there, that is not supported from the premises. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that answer I would like for you to exactly because of that for such human sometimes we can do. How do you see it that we try to recreate something human by the artificial intelligence where it cannot be human by this metaconnection or other aspects of that data that are to be from a certain pool, but that cannot be sensed by experiences, by touch, or by a world by itself.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, there are attempts to do it through embodied AI, so-called, but that we're just feeding, instead of feeding it just text, we're feeding it more other modalities. So again, I don't think it solves the problem because it doesn't have a metacognition embedded in the architecture itself.
So would you say that we're trying to build cognitive architecture that are not mostly based on human and more based on machines?
Well, I mean, if you talk about LLMs, I don't think the human is even there. I mean, it just produces human-like output, but I don't think it tries to understand how humans work. I think that's at least my take on it. Maybe some people will disagree. I know quite a few will disagree, but I don't think it's trying to mimic it in any way, or it can internally. But I'm a more of a proponent of trying to understand it ourselves and trying to build it into a system from the ground up, instead of trying to learn it from the data. I think I have to finish now, so sorry about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. We'll talk about it later.
Thanks, Steve.